December 24, 1944. The sun sank over the wire fences of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, casting long shadows across the snow-packed earth. Inside the perimeter, Japanese prisoners of war huddled in their barracks, their breath turning white in the frigid air. Guards paced in thick coats, rifles slung at the ready, boots crunching against frozen gravel. It was Christmas Eve in America, yet within the barbed wire stood hundreds of captured soldiers of the Emperor, men once trained to die before surrender. For them, surrender had been shame enough. Now they braced for hostility, punishment, perhaps even neglect. What they did not expect, what they could not believe, was kindness. Camp McCoy Guard Log, Deck 1944. The lights flickered on in the mess hall. Inside, American guards had prepared tables with food, bread, potatoes, meat, even decorations scrounged from local donations. A tree cut from nearby woods stood at the center, decorated with paper chains. When the Japanese prisoners were told they could enter, hesitation swept over the ranks. Many thought it a trick or a humiliation staged for propaganda. They moved slowly, uncertain. Yet when the guards gestured, when they saw no malice, only a strange solemnity in the Americans' eyes, they stepped forward. The sound of boots against wooden floors echoed through the hall, as men who had once fought at Guadalcanal and Saipan took their seats at tables draped in rough cloth. U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Division, 1945. The clash of worlds in that room was almost unbearable. The Japanese had been taught Americans were brutal, inhuman, incapable of mercy. Surrender itself was a disgrace under the Bushidō code. To survive captivity was to live with shame. Yet here, in the heart of an American prison, they were offered something unthinkable: a seat at a Christmas table. Some of the guards brought out accordions and fiddles. A few prisoners, once students or clerks before the war, recognized the melodies of European hymns. They sat stiff-backed, torn between suspicion and wonder. Bundesarchiv, POW Interrogation Memo, 1946. To understand the shock, one must recall the winter of 1944. Across the Pacific, U.S. forces were grinding forward. MacArthur in the Philippines, Nimitz across the Central Pacific Islands. Casualty lists grew with each landing. At Leyte in October, the Japanese had launched desperate kamikaze attacks. In Europe, the Ardennes offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, raged under bitter skies. American families feared telegrams from the War Department at any hour. And yet here, thousands of miles from the front, soldiers in Wisconsin chose to treat their enemies not as monsters but as men. War Department Weekly Report, Deck 1944. Japanese prisoners numbered in the tens of thousands across the United States by that winter. Many had been captured on islands like Attu, in the Aleutians, or during naval battles where survival in the water meant eventual capture. At first, these men had been prepared for cruelty. Japanese military doctrine warned that surrender to Westerners meant torture and starvation. Instead, camps like Camp McCoy followed the Geneva Convention of 1929. Prisoners were given food, shelter, and, within limits, the chance to maintain cultural traditions. The guards were often Midwestern farm boys, young men who had never traveled far from home, now ordered to stand watch over enemy soldiers they had once been taught to hate. Geneva Convention Compliance Report, 1945. The scene at Christmas became one of the most startling moments of cultural collision. For Japanese prisoners, the concept of celebrating a foreign religious holiday was alien. Christianity had been suppressed for centuries in Japan, only tolerated in limited form by the 20th century. To many, the nativity story was a myth from another civilization. Yet the spectacle of guards treating them with dignity, singing hymns, breaking bread, sharing laughter, left an impression deeper than any propaganda leaflet could. One prisoner later wrote that, "We felt as if we were ghosts seeing a kindness not meant for us." POW Memoir, translated 1947. American policy was not purely sentimental. Psychological warfare experts believed that humane treatment could weaken the will of enemy combatants still in the field. If word reached Japan that prisoners were not slaughtered, more might surrender rather than fight to the last man. In contrast, when Japanese soldiers captured Americans, brutal treatment was common, from the Bataan Death March to labor camps in Burma. This stark contrast made the Christmas celebrations all the more bewildering for the POWs. U.S. Office of War Information Report, 1944. At Camp McCoy, guards allowed prisoners to perform songs in their own language. A few brought out handmade instruments fashioned from scrap wood and wire. They sang traditional Japanese folk tunes, voices carrying across the frozen camp. American guards, though unable to understand the words, listened quietly. Some clapped. One or two veterans of Pacific battles themselves turned away, their faces unreadable. For them, the memory of dead comrades lay too close, but still discipline held. No violence erupted. The night passed in fragile peace. U.S. Army Guard Diary, Dec 25, 1944. The larger context was extraordinary. By the end of 1944, there were approximately 50,000 Japanese POWs held in the United States. They lived in camps scattered from California to the Midwest, often put to work in agriculture, replacing local men who had gone to war. Their survival rates were dramatically higher than Americans held by Japan. And while discipline was strict, events like the Christmas gatherings showed a remarkable contrast in philosophy. Where the Japanese military glorified sacrifice and death, the Americans, though capable of immense brutality in combat, believed in showing order, control, and even humanity once the fighting stopped. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Yet not all prisoners welcomed this mercy. Some refused to enter the hall, preferring the cold silence of their barracks. They believed participation was dishonor. A few even plotted suicide rather than endure what they considered humiliation. In one camp, intelligence reports noted that Japanese officers berated their men for accepting enemy charity and warned that word of such weakness must never reach Japan. Still, for many rank-and-file soldiers, the sight of American guards treating them as fellow men began to erode the iron discipline of Bushidō. Military Intelligence Division Report, Jan 1945. The moment at Christmas was just one night, one fragile pause in a war of global violence. Outside the camp, headlines spoke of carnage. Inside, for a few hours, enemies sat across tables breaking bread in the dead of winter. The guards could not know what memories those prisoners carried with them, nor how such treatment would ripple across decades. But the astonishment in the POWs' eyes, the disbelief that Americans would grant them celebration instead of scorn, marked the beginning of a deeper revelation. For behind barbed wire, beneath watchtowers and searchlights, the prisoners had begun to glimpse something that would haunt them long after war's end. And in the days ahead, as interrogators sifted through diaries and reports, as guards watched their prisoners more closely, the question grew sharper. Was kindness a weapon more powerful than fear? January 1945. Snow still blanketed the barracks at Camp McCoy, but whispers of what had happened on Christmas Eve lingered among the prisoners. For some, the memory was unsettling, a strange kindness they could not reconcile with everything they had been taught. For others, it was a crack in the wall of their beliefs. The Americans had revealed a hidden advantage, not of steel or firepower, but of philosophy, discipline, and psychology. Yet behind the warmth of carols and bread lay another truth. The U.S. war machine was not just built on mercy. It was fueled by logistics, precision engineering, and technologies the Japanese never fully understood. U.S. War Department Report, Jan 1945. The greatest hidden edge was communication. By 1944, nearly every American infantry platoon carried compact FM radios, often produced by Motorola under military contracts. Unlike older AM systems, which crackled with static and betrayed positions to eavesdropping enemies, FM radios delivered clear signals resistant to interference from terrain or weather. Japanese soldiers relying on flags, runners, or primitive AM sets could not fathom how American units seemed to move as one organism, reacting faster than human messengers could possibly allow. Prisoners at Camp McCoy asked their interrogators how Americans always seemed to know where we would strike. The answer was not sorcery, but frequency modulation, an invention perfected in American laboratories by engineers like Edwin Howard Armstrong and manufactured at scale by factories in Illinois and New Jersey. Technical Manual TM 11-615, 1943. This advantage was not abstract. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, U.S. carrier groups coordinated strikes across hundreds of miles of ocean. Task Force 38 launched waves of aircraft, with pilots guided by radar operators, and relayed orders through FM channels. Japanese fleet commanders, bound to slower, rigid communication doctrines, could not keep pace. Admiral Kurita's forces found themselves scattered, ambushed, and misled. Survivors later admitted bewilderment at the Americans' speed. They were like a hand with many fingers, all striking at once, dramatized composite. U.S. Navy Action Report, Oct. 1944. The Japanese POWs at McCoy, though far from the Pacific, heard stories of these battles during interrogation sessions. Some engineers among them had worked on field radios for the Imperial Army. They studied captured American sets with astonishment. The SCR-300 backpack radio, introduced in 1943, weighed about 35 pounds, operated on FM bands between 40–48 MHz, and provided reliable communication up to 3 miles. The smaller SCR-536 handy-talkie, at just 5 pounds, gave squad leaders immediate contact with their platoons. To Japanese officers accustomed to shouting across hillsides or dispatching runners through jungle undergrowth, such tools seemed otherworldly. Signal Corps Field Report 1944, but communication was only part of the equation. American logistics staggered the imagination of captured soldiers. A single U.S. infantry division arriving in the Pacific could bring over 14,000 men, supported by 500 vehicles, 48 artillery pieces, and thousands of tons of supplies. Liberty ships, mass-produced in yards like Bethlehem Steel and Kaiser shipyards, carried these divisions across oceans at a rate Japan could never match. A new Liberty ship slid off the ways every 3 days by 1944, while Japanese yards struggled to replace even a fraction of their losses. Maritime Commission Report 1944. At Camp McCoy, POWs saw this industrial strength reflected in small but telling ways. Uniforms were plentiful. Guards rotated gear without shortages. Even their food, fresh bread, canned meat, milk, testified to supply chains that stretched seamlessly across a continent. Japanese soldiers, who had gnawed on rice balls hardened by days in the jungle, marveled at rations so abundant that guards sometimes discarded leftovers. One prisoner was recorded muttering, "America wages war with its stomach." POW Interrogation Record, 1945. The secret was not merely abundance, but the system behind it. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps employed punch-card machines and early IBM data processing to track shipments, requisitions, and storage. Engineers in Detroit built tanks at the Chrysler-managed Detroit Arsenal, turning out an M4 Sherman every 30 minutes. Aircraft plants at Boeing and Grumman rolled fighters and bombers into the skies faster than Japanese planners could calculate. By 1944, the U.S. produced nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year. Japan managed fewer than 30,000, many of inferior quality. U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, 1946. This imbalance played out in bloody detail on the battlefield. Consider the Battle of Peleliu, September 15, 1944. U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed coral beaches under withering fire. The Japanese defenders, numbering about 10,000, fought from honeycombed caves and bunkers. Yet once the Americans established their beachhead, their radios and artillery coordination gave them overwhelming control. Forward observers carrying SCR-536 radios directed naval gunfire onto Japanese strongpoints with pinpoint accuracy. Mortar crews received corrections in real time. Where the Japanese relied on preset firing plans and immovable doctrine, the Americans adapted moment by moment. The cost was still horrific, over 9,000 Marine casualties, but Japanese losses reached near annihilation. Captured survivors would later say they had felt hunted, unable to comprehend how Americans shifted fire with such speed. U.S. Marine Corps After-Action Report 1944. Engineers and inventors remained the unseen soldiers of this war. Edwin Armstrong's FM design saved countless American lives. Henry Kaiser's shipyards ensured supplies never ran dry. Even refrigeration, an often overlooked innovation, kept meat and medical supplies fresh across Pacific voyages, giving Americans endurance their foes lacked. Japanese POWs working in American farms or factories glimpsed this machinery at work, and some wrote in diaries that America's weapon is not only the bomb or gun, but the factory behind the farmer. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. As 1945 began, the prisoners' disbelief deepened. They had been told America was decadent, soft, incapable of sacrifice. Instead, they saw a society where farm boys could become guards, engineers could become officers, and factories could become arsenals overnight. The Christmas feast was not an isolated gesture. It was a symptom of something larger, a nation so confident in its resources that it could show mercy even to its enemies. For the Japanese captives, who had known only scarcity and fear, this realization was as destabilizing as any bomb. Still, in the minds of the U.S. Army, kindness was a calculated instrument. Officers monitored morale inside the camps. If prisoners began to question the infallibility of their empire, if they returned home one day with stories of humane treatment, the effect on Japan's war effort could be corrosive. And even as Allied forces prepared to storm Iwo Jima and Okinawa, far away in snowy Wisconsin, the battle for perception was already underway. But could mercy truly weaken a warrior culture that glorified death? Or would it plant seeds of resentment instead, twisting kindness into humiliation? The answer, as the war's end approached, would reveal itself in both surrender and legacy. August 15, 1945. Radio static crackled across the camps of America. At Camp McCoy, guards and prisoners alike crowded around loudspeakers. The voice of Emperor Hirohito, distant and trembling, announced Japan's surrender. For many Japanese POWs, the words were beyond comprehension. Their godlike sovereign had spoken of defeat, of enduring the unendurable. In that instant, the war they had believed eternal was over. Outside the fences, church bells rang. Inside, silence hung heavy, broken only by the shifting of boots and the creak of wood. NHK radio broadcast transcript, August 1945. The surrender did not erase memories of battle. But for the prisoners, something else had taken root during their captivity. The Christmas feast, the humane rations, the chance to work on farms instead of starving in cages. These experiences gnawed at the steel pillars of Bushidō. Allied interrogators noted that many POWs, once hostile and uncooperative, grew willing to talk after months of exposure to American order and discipline. It was not broken bones or starvation that opened their tongues. It was decency. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For the Americans, the impact was equally profound. Guards stationed at Camp McCoy and similar camps carried memories home, telling families how enemies who had fought ferociously could also sit quietly at a Christmas table. Veterans wrote letters describing how mercy, unexpectedly, had not weakened security, but strengthened discipline. The paradox of the war became clearer. The United States could unleash firebombing raids that reduced Tokyo to ash, yet within its own borders, it chose to honor the Geneva Convention and even extend gestures of humanity. War Department Morale Division Report, 1946. Strategically, the humane treatment of prisoners was more than moral choice. It became psychological warfare. Reports compiled in 1946 showed that Japanese POWs returned to Japan, carrying stories of fairness, abundance, and dignity. These accounts undermined Tokyo's wartime propaganda, which had painted Americans as demons and barbarians. In the tense years of occupation that followed, such testimonies helped U.S. forces establish control with less resistance than feared. The seeds planted in snowy barracks in Wisconsin bore fruit in shattered cities across the Pacific. Allied Translator and Interpreter Section Report, 1946. The engineering behind America's dominance also continued shaping the post-war world. FM communication, perfected by Armstrong, became the backbone of both military doctrine and civilian broadcasting. The radios that once guided artillery on Peleliu would evolve into systems that linked NATO armies during the Cold War. Mass production, pioneered in Detroit and Kaiser shipyards, became the template for America's arsenal of democracy. Even refrigeration, so vital in sustaining forces across oceans, laid foundations for global food distribution networks in peacetime. The POWs who marveled at canned milk and fresh bread had, unknowingly, glimpsed the future of industrial civilization. Office of Technical Services Report, 1947, yet the human cost could not be ignored. By war's end, over 12,000 Americans had died in Japanese captivity, many through brutal neglect. Survivors of the Bataan Death March or Changi prison carried scars that no feast could erase. For them, the idea that Japanese prisoners celebrated Christmas under watchful but merciful guards was almost unbearable. "We buried men like dogs in the Philippines," one veteran later said, while they sat warm in Wisconsin. Veteran Oral History Archive, 1982. The contradiction haunted policymakers, yet it also underscored America's determination to prove that it fought by different rules. Within Japan, returning POWs were often shunned. Branded as disgraced men for having surrendered, they lived in quiet shame. But many whispered their strange stories, that Americans had not starved them, that some had even let them sing, that one Christmas, enemies had treated them like equals. For younger generations, hearing these tales, the myth of America as an unfeeling brute began to dissolve. Japanese POW returnee memoir, 1950. The legacy carried into the Cold War. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, U.S. doctrine on POW treatment drew directly from World War II lessons. The Christmas at Camp McCoy became a symbolic reminder that mercy, discipline, and logistical supremacy could win hearts as well as battles. At the same time, military planners never forgot that kindness was also strategy. Humanitarian acts became tools of influence, designed to fracture enemy morale and shape post-war politics. U.S. Army Training Manual, 1951. On a broader canvas, the story speaks to the strange duality of modern warfare. Industrial strength allowed America to produce tanks, planes, and bombs in numbers Japan could never match. But it also gave America the confidence to show compassion even to those who had sworn to kill them. The same system that created the Sherman tank also created the Christmas dinner. It was an arsenal not only of democracy, but of dignity. Psychologists studying Japanese POW reactions noted that mercy often cut deeper than cruelty. Where brutality hardened resolve, unexpected humanity bred confusion, doubt, and sometimes respect. A captured officer reportedly confessed, "We were told Americans were savages, but they treated us as men. It is harder to hate them now," dramatized composite. Army Interrogation Analysis, 1946. The legacy of those quiet nights in Wisconsin lived long after the wire fences came down. Many former POWs later supported the U.S.-Japan alliance, recognizing that their captors had given them glimpses of a different way of war. Some wrote memoirs. Others simply passed their memories to children and grandchildren. In those recollections, the sound of carols mixing with Japanese folk songs in a drafty hall became a symbol of a turning point. It was a moment when war's brutality met a gesture of grace. By the mid-20th century, the lesson was clear. Firepower might win battles, but perception shaped peace. The Americans had wielded abundance, engineering, and discipline as weapons more powerful than bayonets. They had proven that in modern war, victory lay not only in crushing the enemy, but in rewriting the very image of what an enemy could be. As one former guard, now old and grey, remembered decades later, that night, we showed them something they did not expect. And maybe that mattered more than the rifles on the towers. Veteran Interview, 1972. In the end, the Christmas of 1944 at Camp McCoy was not just a holiday gathering. It was a psychological campaign, a cultural collision, and a glimpse into the strange power of humanity amid destruction. It showed that kindness could unsettle as deeply as cruelty, and that mercy itself could be a weapon of war. For when the guns finally fell silent, it was not only steel and fire that shaped the world to come. It was also the memory of a night when enemies sat together at a table, bewildered by grace, and began to understand that the future of warfare belonged not to those who glorified death, but to those who mastered the strength to show life.